Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hello, my darlings. Today we have more of that dog lady, Lacy Beautiful Dreamer by Bear64. Beautiful dreamer, wake unto me. Starlight and dewdrops are waiting for thee. Sounds of the rude world heard in the day, lulled by the moonlight, will all pass away. My latest rendition of the old standard tune ended abruptly as I heard a familiar ruff and a low growl from just inside the trees. It was getting late, and I decided that after a long afternoon of yard work, it would be nice to relax in the shadows of the forest. I'd also held out some hope that my best friend might make an appearance, and there she was, preternaturally still, standing near the trunk of a large pine. She peeked around the bole in a playful manner, yet her eyes blazed red and her mouth gaped in an awful grin, full of fangs and horror, and were we standing closer to one another, I knew a foul stench. I grinned back at her. "Hey, sweet lady, I take it you are well?" Her menacing grin widened, and she panted a little in pleasure at the greeting as she stepped from behind a big pine and walked towards me. As she drew near, she dropped to all fours and nuzzled my hand in a doggy greeting. She gave out a little whine. Dogs know how to play people. There was a hint in that sound as though she desperately needed just a scratch behind the ears and above the base of her tail to save her life. "Drama queen," I said to the massive beast that had started life as a fluffy little puppy. My fluffy little puppy, Lace. Yet I relented, as we knew I would, and proffered the scratches. She rose once more and gave me a quick dog kiss on the cheek. I had to choke back a gag at the odious wave of her breath. Then she stepped back and gave me her best goofy dog grin, mixed with the way her face had evolved into the more sinister features. "You want to have supper with me?" I knew she wouldn't. Months after her final transformation, she preferred her own fresh kills, but it had become one of our games for me to ask. She surprised me, though, by getting a twinkle in her otherwise ballful eyes and nodding. "Well, I have a pot roast in the crock." She turned and bounded back a little ways into the tree line and dropped to all fours again. She raced around through the trees and popped out again a little ways from me, a piece of wet, dripping dead critter in her maw. Even as a dogman, Lucy had a great sense of humor. One just had to speak to understand the doggish language. Maybe dogginese? I thought as we walked over to the back porch and the little patio set. It's amazing what we can adapt to and perceive as normal when we love those involved. I ate pot roast with some grilled veggies, and Lacy chomped her raw red meat, still giving off a little steam. Poor creature's temperature must have been up after running from my pooch lady. Miriam had to work late this evening, or she'd have joined us. Someone had an injured cow or bull or something. Lacy stopped mid-chomp and looked at me askance. She said it may have been coyotes or feral dogs. You have a different theory? I feared for a moment that she may have gone more feral than expected. Nah, not Lacy. She actually understands what would happen if she fed on livestock, I thought, all too willing to give her a pass. She sat silently for a moment, clearly trying to think of a way to clearly communicate what she knew or believed she knew. Finally, she stretched her head down low and used her right foreclaw to point at her neck, the place where she had 4 pink scars from when the Lacy Elbert werewolf bit her and started this journey. I leaned back in my patio chair. So you think it was another werewolf? At that, she gave a little shrug. I was often surprised at how much she'd picked up off human gestures. Maybe so many millennia of human and canine interaction had led to some cross-species nonverbal communication gestures. I'd read something on dogs actually understanding humans better than we realize. Besides, Lacy had been exceptional, at least in my perfectly unbiased view. I roll. Not sure. Just not coyotes or dogs. She gave me a nod. Well, golly gee, Lassie. Did little Timmy get bitten by the other Lacy before he fell down the well and needed to be rescued? Her look was priceless. The sinister dogman features contorted in deep and genuine confusion. She looked quite hideous, so naturally I laughed. Sorry, girl. There was no way for you to get that reference. I just meant that it seems we may have another monster on our hands. She resumed her normal, merely sinister grin, jaw gaping, gleaming fangs displayed, and a little drool escaping from one side where her tongue lolled. Tell you what, I'll get with Miriam and work on the who might be missing angle, and you, well, keep doing your thing. A few people know about you. I had to tell Sheriff Cloud so that if anyone sees you and freaks out, he can read direct. I told that nice lead paramedic, too. She needed to know about the toxic bites and scratches. So maybe the High Sheriff will have some information for us. Lacy had gulped down the remainder of her meal and clearly wanted to get back into the woods. So we rose and I hugged and patted my enormous rescue shelter pup and rubbed her back. She tilted her head up a little and gave a little howl of pleasure, parting in sheer joyful exuberance. Then in a flash, she swirled away and vanished into the darkness. We both had work to do. Valerie pulled out onto the highway from the parking lot of Pliny's Delight Package Store. Fine wines, liquor, and beer. She was en route back to her dead-end little hometown and would need the booze to numb her mind to the utter boredom that would ensue for the duration of her stay. She'd come down for her brother's memorial service about 6 months before and was now back to sell their ancestral estate. She rolled her eyes. If you can call a 3-bedroom wood-frame house on half an acre an estate. Still, she would sell eventually, and she could use the income to pay off her townhome in the big city. They'd cremated Philippe before she'd arrived, and the local yokels had been short of answers as to what exactly had happened to him. She still had a few acquaintances, no real friends, but a few who might talk under the right circumstances, in complete privacy and confidence, or if there was something in it for them. So far, all she knew was that her brother's trashy girlfriend had been responsible. Still, it didn't make sense. She thought for the umpteenth time as she made the nighttime drive towards the wide spot in the road that she'd called home until her 18th birthday. Her father had disappeared when she was 9, and in the intervening years, she'd lost her mother and now her baby brother, Phil. Phil had been pretty smitten with Lacy Elbert. The girl had been pretty, but Valerie thought that there was something wild about her. Not in the partying sense, but rather something gamey, she decided. A bit of the local wilderness infected the young woman. That's probably what Phil had liked. He had enjoyed the great outdoors, of which there was plenty in this area. The trees went on for miles. Merde, she exclaimed. as her headlights lit up a large animal in front of her speeding Jeep. It ran across the road and scampered into some trees on the other side. If something so large could be said to have scampered, she braked and swerved to avoid a collision and knew that it had cleared the roadway. But a thump sounded on her passenger side rear fender and caused her to swerve. Something large had struck her vehicle. Once she corrected the skid, she pressed her brakes and checked the mirrors. In the bright red of the brake lights, she saw an enormous hair-covered figure that stood in the middle of the highway in a menacing posture, arms akimbo, claws on display, and ferocious maw open, and emitting a roar. She had slowed significantly, and as she started, fixated at the horrific scene behind her, she nearly failed to note the return of the first figure that had darted in front of her. This one was slightly less bulging, but had longer and wilder hair. It ran at her car from within the blackness of the nighttime forest, now on two legs. Instead of stopping, she smoothly pressed the accelerator to avoid the loping beast. It struck the driver's side fender, and she heard the ear-splitting shriek of razor talons as they scraped the metal of her vehicle in an attempt to seize and stop the machine. She continued to accelerate and saw in the mirror that both nightmares now chased her on all fours and were closing fast. She downshifted and pushed the engine to red line before gearing back up. It was a near thing, but eventually when she checked the mirrors, the duo had vanished into the gloom. She shook with fear and the effects of massive adrenaline dump. She glanced around nervously in fear that at any moment one or both of the bipedal lupine horrors would pounce from the murky shadows. She slowly regained control of her breathing, in through the nose. 3 count, hold. 3 count, release. 3 count. After 3 sets, she felt slightly more calm. She desperately wanted to stop and look at the damage her Jeep had surely sustained, but she didn't dare. Maybe it would be a good time to have a word with the local law enforcers. She needed a police report for the insurance company, and she might be able to coax some information from them if she properly played the part of a damsel in distress. Deputy Barnum met her at the house to take her report. Valerie wasn't sure about how to describe the creatures that attacked her, so she went for the simplest explanation, of which she tried to convince herself during the drive to her little hometown. People in outlandish costumes. She could tell that Deputy Barnum was skeptical. He worked very hard to project his disbelief. So, ma'am, you're saying you saw these people, maybe in costumes, maybe with large dogs, after you left the liquor store? She crossed her arms defiantly and in frustration. For the 4th time, yes. I haven't had a drop, and none of my containers are open. In fact, you can see that they fell from my front seat onto the floor. I haven't even cleaned out the car, nor gone inside the house. I don't know who or what the beings were, but they were hairy and tall and hit my Jeep hard enough to do that. She pointed at the large dent in the passenger side, rear fender, and the deep gouges along the driver's side. Deputy Barnum nodded. Yes, ma'am. I just want to get it straight for the record. Did you see either of them hold any instruments that could do that damage? Maybe an iron rake or garden tool? Valerie chewed her lip. She really wanted to punch this backwoods Sherlock and deal with the hounds of the backwoodsville herself. Maybe, but there was no long handles. They could have carried some sort of claw instrument. The interview went on for another 15 minutes or so, and Deputy Barnum gave her some unsatisfying and unlikely assurances that the sheriff's department would look into the incident, and that she could pick up a copy of the report day after tomorrow. While it was good to have the incident recorded, she had the feeling that Barnum knew something more, but was hesitant to tell her. Well, she could at last mix that favorite drink. Mr. Arends from the bank brought his dog Fritz and said that he saw a notice of foreclosure about to be served on the Elbert place. I thought old Kenny would have left it to his nephew and niece, Nancy and Drew. Huh! I don't think they could read, much less solve mysteries. They live even further out in the sticks, though. Maybe they never found out about the inheritance, Miriam speculated as we reclined on the sofa. She'd had yet another long day, mainly backed-up appointments from after her moo cow emergency. Well, I wonder who was left of them after Sheriff Cloud and the JP told me about the murders. Any idea if the boyfriend had any family? I didn't want to press her with bigger questions. She was tired. Oh, yes, he was a local boy, but his daddy ran off when he was little. And then his sister went off to college and work in the big city. Then his mom died. Sweet lady. His wife was like a country song. I was a teenager, my daddy run off, and my mama died. I was smitten and bitten by my werewolf girlfriend. She sang the last in a silly, twangy voice and tune. How's the cow? I asked innocently. If she was too tired, she'd give a short answer. If she felt like talking, then we could discuss it. Certainly not coyotes or even a cougar. The bite radius was huge. If we had bears, maybe something like a large wolf or dog? She trailed off, and I could hear the question and the implications that Lacy could be the culprit. I knew that Miriam wouldn't want to believe it, but she, like me, had to know for sure. Well, it wasn't a certain dog girl, I asked her. She thinks there may be another werewolf. I must say I agree. One had to have infected the Elbert girl. I just don't know that much about werewolves. She looked pretty similar to our Lacy, and they both went on 4 legs as often as 2. But there was a different quality and some difference in shape. That were Lacy was tremendously spiteful to our Lacy. Definitely held a grudge about that first night. I still think Lacy must have gotten in the way of her hunt for a meal. Maybe I'll ask her. Miriam chuckled. You're the only man I've ever heard of who can hold a conversation with his dog. Those rescue puppies are remarkable. Oh, and so are you. The rest of that evening is none of your business. But I had noticed that since I recovered from the werewolf scratches, I'd been feeling vigorous. My aches and pains all but forgotten. I sat across from Sheriff Gene Cloud in his office, and we each sipped on a cup of very good coffee. Apparently, over his years in the law enforcement, old Gene had become a connoisseur de café. We'd come to the end of pleasantries and small talk. He got around to the point. Earl, I hate to ask, but do you think that, dog of yours, do you think she may have had anything to do with the attack on that steer? Thing is, the bite and the claw marks would be consistent with, well, you know, a creature of her size and configuration. Jean and I had become friends since the night we called the Howling Incident, after the old werewolf movie from the 80s, so I could understand why he was hesitant to ask. I think that he really didn't want it to be Lacy either. Well, that would sound weird to anyone else, but you've seen some things. I asked her, and it was my turn to be hesitant. She denies it. Thinks it may be another werewolf. Jean nodded. Oddly, the fact that you talked to your transmogrified pooch is not what concerns me. However, I've worked with enough teens and young adults to know that sometimes they come up with convenient and usually imaginary culprits to redirect attention from their behavior to other parties. It's not that they're being bad. It's a pretty normal type of psychological avoidance. They don't want to hurt or disappoint a respected figure in their lives, and they don't want to process the guilt they feel. I shook my head. Lacy started life as a dog. She doesn't really know how to lie. I haven't taught her, so now I believe her. I know how parents are about defending their kids. They'll employ all sorts of mental gymnastics to avoid acknowledging the poor behavior of their brats. You know, Mr. Masters of Science, denial. I smiled at the last to ensure he knew I was teasing. I actually respected his formal education, and he'd been right about the concept of avoidance. Lacy was still pretty young. Nah, I couldn't start doubting her. She was a good girl. We discussed the possibilities of other wildlife that could have been involved, or even humans. In the end, the Lord High Sheriff of the county decided it would remain a mystery. He'd put animal predation on the report so the owner could file an insurance claim for the loss. I think he may still have suspected Lacy, but he let it go, mainly because there was no real evidence, but also because he was a county sheriff, and we were friends. Always easier to believe the reality we want, Mr. Psych Major. Benny Diaz had had a long day. This last service had been the worst. It had taken him 2 hours to find the manufactured home on its quarter-acre plot. Why can't they just call them trailers? Hiding the wheels and adding fake shutters doesn't change anything, he thought with distaste. Doesn't matter, I'll soon be home and enjoying Danetta's fine cooking. Now I need to ensure that no feral animals or humans had taken up residence in or around the trailer or the little shed to one side before he risked an approach up to the raised porch and knocked on the front door. Per policy, he knocked on the door and called out his name and company, and that he was there to serve process. No answer. No surprise. He checked the windows and saw that the lights were out. He was pretty sure that the power had been cut off already. He posted the notice on the door and gave warning that the mortgage payments of the one Kenneth Elbert were in arrears and that the foreclosure process would begin in 60 days. There was more to the initial notice, and the bank had added the names of the co-beneficiaries of Kenneth Elbert's last will and testament, his twin niece and nephew, Nancy and Drew Elbert. Done. Now for home. He didn't finish the thought, as he suddenly found himself airborne and flying from the raised porch at the front door. The earth rose up to meet him, and he felt some of the ribs on his left side snap. Some of the right may have been snapped as well, but the shredded flesh above them stung, burned, and hurt too much for him to be sure. He attempted to choke in a breath in genuine misery when a set of jaws clamped onto the back of his neck, and the beast that had been Drew Elbert shook him like a terrier shakes rats. His neck snapped just like a rodent. His final thought was, Danetta's fine cooking. Now he'd be on the receiving end of supper. Valerie drew up to the trailer where her erstwhile soon-to-be sister-in-law and her parents had lived, where the parents and her brother had died. It wasn't a terrible place. It was a fairly recent model of manufactured home. Phil had helped Kenny Elbert build that really nice, if very tall, porch. The whole place sat on a slight slope that left the front entrance higher off the ground than the back door entrance. She'd never been here as a child or teen. Lacy Elbert was younger than both she and her brother, so there was no need to go out that way. The place looked empty, though, despite the newer model car parked in the driveway, and had the quality of silence that speaks of lingering abandonment. Even the air smelled of. "Phew!" she exclaimed as she retched, and the acid rose into her chest and burned uncomfortably. The smell out in the yard was foul. Blood, open bowels, and early stages of decay. Something had clearly expired in a violent manner nearby. Something large. There it was, a mass of dried gore, lumps of flesh, and some scattered broken bones. The rounded mound of a skull protruded from the middle. A human skull, she realized in consternation. She scrambled for her phone, dialed the emergency number, and darted her gaze around to scan for danger. Likely long gone, but she didn't want to take chances. The nearest neighbors had property lines that ran up near the home, but their houses and mobiles were far enough from this one that everyone had at least the illusion of privacy. And there were screens of bushes on the front and back property lines of the trailer. That meant there was likely no eyes on her. However, she walked back to her Jeep and stood by the driver door. The signal was pretty weak, so she didn't want to risk losing it by getting inside the metal box on wheels. Besides, she'd seen too many horror movies where people jumped into cars to be safe. Then wham! The monster, or whatever, got them. The dispatcher finally answered and asked for the nature of her emergency. She gave her location and said she'd found human remains. No, fresh remains. The blood looked dried, but I didn't want to go near the thing. It's grotesque. The operator assured her that deputies and the ambulance were on the way, and she should remain calm and stay on the line. Valerie rolled her eyes and thought uncharitably, "If I have to keep conversing with you, Cousin Ellie Mae, I will lose it." She pretended to have signal issues, then dropped the call. She looked around nervously. She knew it would take time for help to arrive. She warily watched the wood line on the north side of the property. Any creepy crawlers would come from that direction. She was startled, and adrenaline shock washed through her body when the double tap of a small car horn sounded sharply from behind her. "Merde, I'm tired of these jump scares," she shouted internally as she turned to face the roadway. A small car that had seen better days, long ago, sat rattling and rumbling in the driveway entrance, but still facing down the road. Likely a neighbor. "Howdy, you looking for the Elberts?" a youngish man in a ball cap asked as he leaned his elbow on the open window. Valerie eyed him. She knew enough about the people in the area to understand that he was likely just trying to help and was only a little nosy. "Actually, I know what happened to them. My brother Philippe was dating Lacy. I just came to see because of what happened." He nodded. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm from the next house up the way with my folks. I met Phil. He sure was nice. I'm sorry about your loss. You just had that look about you that said you might need help." Valerie nodded. "Well, actually, I just got off the phone with the sheriff's department dispatch. There are human remains over there on the far side of the porch. A real mess. Would you mind staying here with me until they arrive? It should only be a few minutes." The young man hesitated just a moment to process what he had just heard, then nodded. He moved his car so that it would not block the driveway, then parked it and got out to approach Valerie. "Sean Mason," he said as he extended a hand for a shake. "Val LaFiva," she responded. "I grew up around here, but have been gone a few years." "Yeah, I remember Phil said something about a big sister in the big city. So where?" At that point, the breeze shifted, and the smell registered, and he blanched and stepped backwards, and waved his hand frantically as though fending off an assault on his nostrils. Despite her stress level, Valerie had to suppress a laugh at the look on his face. Yet Sean seemed to handle it well. He recovered his composure and walked a little closer to the pile that had once been a person. I wouldn't get too close, Valerie warned. He or she, who can tell, is beyond first aid, and the cops will likely want to look for evidence. Wouldn't want to mess up a crime scene. He nodded and halted his forward progress, but started. I dunno, but I think it's a guy. That's a tie near the skull. Maybe just blood splatter, but I think it's an ugly tie. Shortly, the wail of sirens sounded in the distance, and the cavalry arrived to save the day. It was late afternoon, and getting on towards the end of the day before they released Valerie from the scene. They'd cut Sean loose within an hour. He had to get to work at the plant. Valerie, who was a relative stranger, and who had filed a decent, suspicious report, well, she had to remain on the foul-smelling scene. The deputies had finished speaking with her and asked her to wait, and then had gotten busy. She hung out with the nice lead paramedic, Julie, while the techs processed the scene and waited for the sheriff and JP to arrive. She and Julie could hear snippets of the conversation others had. Same as the steer the other day. Had to be big, just like that one brook. Footprints, woods. Valerie jumped a little when Julie spoke. We had a scene like this a while back. Well, a little different, but just as messy. Over at the Brooks house. Used to be the Lee's family place. She looked at Val to see if there was any hint of recognition. Yes, I know where the Lees lived. I went to school with one of the daughters. Who are the Brooks? Julie shrugged. Just one, Mr. Brooks, an older man and his dog. Well, I guess they'd both be Brooks. She laughed a little at that. And it seemed to Val that only Julie knew why that was funny. He had just had to shoot Lacy Elbert. You may have heard rumors about that or seen the one news report. He had a nasty scratch on his arm from somewhere wild person or critter. Something big. She raised her chin towards the scene, and Val followed her gaze, quickly lost in thought. Within the hedge and brush property, boundaries squatted two unnaturally still figures, each with its large ears turned to what the human said. They were pleased that it had not taken long to draw attention after they took out the human that was taking away the home that Uncle Kenny had meant for them. They soon knew that the Valerie human was related to Cousin Lacy's boyfriend. Lacy had probably not intended to kill him. Drew listened carefully to what the female said, and Nancy focused on the conversation of the humans who worked around what they called the scene. They shortly had the information they sought for some time. An old man and his dog had attacked their cousin and killed her. Now they knew where he lived. Brooks, the old Lee place. Deputy Barnum made it to the scene at the Elbert residence near the beginning of his shift, just in time to meet with the cleanup crew assigned to pick up the corpse. They'd worked by standing lights and headlights of their cars since it was past nightfall. He would only have to be on site for a short time. Hey, fellas, you need help with anything? Nah, we got it, Barnum. Look out for the smell. Still some left, one of the techs advised him. Nowhere near as bad as the Elbert chick, but still pretty ripe. A deep-throated, angry growl arose from just within the woodline. It was quickly followed by a slightly higher-pitched one, and then some scuffling noises and the breaking of branches as large bodies moved deeper into the forest. Barnum looked up, startled, as the two remaining techs whipped their heads towards the trees. There was no sign that anything was there, and only the movements of a few small branches indicated that anyone or anything had been just out of sight. Observing. I'm going to get the trunk to get my rifle, just in case, Barnum informed the others. As his trunk lid squealed open and he reached for his AR platform rifle, a deep octave rose from within the woods, quickly joined by a howl of anger, frustration, and grief. The reverberation sent cold shivers up Barnum's spine. and the two techs finished up quickly. He was very happy when they cleared the scene, and didn't envy the sheriff, Cloud, and Justice Jenny Fiore, who still had to notify the widow. Despite the mess of the body, they had quickly identified the victim by his license plates, what was left of his face, and the driver's license in his wallet. It was only on his way back to the more settled areas, where he normally patrolled, that Barnum thought about the report that Valerie Lefevre had made. It sounded like what she had described. Giant wolves that could run on 2 or 4. So quoth this raven. We have plenty more parts here. This is the first half of Beautiful Dreamer. There is a third chapter after this one, so, 3, maybe 4 more videos. I certainly hope you are enjoying these. It's getting really, really good. Thanks to Bear for sharing them with me on my subreddit, Madam Raven's Darlings. If you have a story you'd like to share as well, please post it there. Thank you all for coming to my little chateau. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams.